The Sydney to Hobart Yacht Race is an annual sailing race, also known as the Blue Water Classic, hosted by the Cruising Yacht Club of Australia. Beginning at 1 p.m. on December 26th, Boxing Day, the race, as its name implies, starts from Sydney, New South Wales, and ends in the city of Hobart, on the island of Tasmania. The Sydney to Hobart Yacht Race spans a total of approximately 630 nautical miles, with the race taking place over the course of several days. This race is also known as one of the most prestigious and difficult sailing races in the entire world to participate in, as the sailors must pass through the eastern portion of the Bass Strait, the region between mainland Australia and the island of Tasmania. The Bass Strait is notorious for its choppy, deep blue waters, unpredictable weather, and powerful winds, which create challenging conditions for the sailors aboard the sailing yachts, as the winds tend to propel the yachts at a much higher speed than during the coastal section of the race. Because of these demanding conditions and the limited number of competing vessels allowed entry into this prestigious race, only those among sailing's elite earn a spot in the crews aboard the vessels in the Sydney to Hobart Yacht Race, as many competitive sailors aspire to one day compete in and even possibly win this grand race. At 1 p.m. on December 26, 1998, the shot was fired to begin the 54th annual Blue Water Classic, and the 115 participating sailing yachts, varying in size from 10 meters long to 24 meters long, began to make their way south out of Sydney Harbour on what would be the first leg of the race. The conditions on the water were ideal for racing, as the vessels were propelled by a southern running current of 4 knots, along with a tailwind blowing from the northeast at speeds ranging from 25 to 35 knots. Throughout the afternoon and into the evening of the 26th, many of the entrants were on a record pace for this first coastal leg of the journey, and by the morning of December 27th, the pack of vessels was approaching the Bass Strait and would begin to embark on the second, more treacherous leg of the race across the strait. In these early morning hours, the first few leading ships of the fleet entered the Bass Strait, preparing for a rough sail across it, as they were warned of an approaching cold front blowing from the southwest by their respective managerial teams back on shore. The leading boats were traveling at an unusually high speed, ripping across the water, as multiple vessels reported traveling at speeds above 20 knots. One of the participating vessels, the AFR Midnight Rambler's navigator, a man named Ed Psaltis, described how the perilous weather conditions battered their vessel as their sailing craft raced through the water. The yacht was going so fast there was a big rooster tail off the stern like a speedboat. We suffered 2 massive broaches during that period. They were really out of control capsizes. People in the water, absolute mayhem. Both times, the little boat just jumped back up and kept going, showing how strong she was, he said. However, as the 27th continued on, the weather continued to worsen, as the warm front that had provided the tailwind for the first coastal portion of the race began to meet with the cold front that was making its way through the Bass Strait from the southwest. The wind speeds quickly began to rise from about 30 knots, soon to 40 knots, and by 1 p.m., one craft, the Sword of Orion, reported constant wind speeds of 50 to 70 knots, with gusts of up to 85 knots, and the seas began to swell from 6 to 8 foot waves to 12 to 14 foot waves, with some sets of the waves reaching heights of 30 to 40 feet. However, as the fleet became aware of these rapidly changing weather conditions, most of them decided to risk heading into the storm rather than to attempt to flee from it, as they reasoned that with how close the storm system was to reaching full force, turning back would be pointless, as the cold front approaching them would soon catch up to them and even potentially put them further in harm's way then proceeding as planned would. By 4 p.m., the storm had picked up even further, and the first yacht from the fleet to be disabled was a yacht named the Stand-Aside, as it floated helplessly at the mercy of the now 60-foot waves after its mast had snapped off after the yacht had rolled over after being hit by a wave. A Coast Guard rescue helicopter was dispatched to aid the stricken sailors aboard the Stand-Aside, and fortunately, they managed to brave the frightening conditions and brought the crew of the Stand-Aside to safety. However, the Stand-Aside would not be the last yacht amongst the fleet that would encounter severe damages that required their evacuations, as the helicopter crews would find themselves working throughout the rest of the day, and would have their hands full evacuating a further 50 sailors from other stricken vessels. At 4:40 p.m. that afternoon, the vessel near the front of the pack that had warned the fleet of the intense weather conditions, the Sword of Orion, made the decision to retire from the race and head back towards the Australian mainland. At 4:50 p.m., the Sword of Orion called a mayday after also doing a complete 360-degree roll after being hit by an 80-foot rogue wave, demasting the vessel in the process, similar to the Stand-Aside. At 4:57 p.m., an emergency position indicating radio beacon device was activated on the Sword of Orion's deck, and at 5:10 p.m., one of the crew members aboard the Sword of Orion, a British man, an Olympian named Glyn Charles, was reported as missing after he was swept overboard and his safety lanyard had snapped, and he was quickly separated from the yacht amidst the intense storm conditions and presumably drowned, becoming the first fatality of several more sailors still yet to come. At around 5:45 p.m. on the evening of December 27th, another vessel in the fleet, the business post Naiad, attempted to make several mayday calls after it too had been rolled and disabled after being struck by a large wave. The only call that managed to go through from the business post Naiad was one to another vessel in the fleet, the Yandis, who then relayed the business post Naiad's mayday call to the Coast Guard at 5:49 p.m. Soon after the roll and the mayday calls, the business post Naiad was struck by another large wave, and the skipper of the vessel, a man named Bruce Guy, subsequently suffered a heart attack, killing him. Another member of the crew aboard the business post Naiad, named Philip Skeggs, was swept over the rails of the ship and became entangled in his safety harness and was held underwater while he struggled to free himself from his safety equipment. Unfortunately, he was unable to free himself and soon drowned as his head was held beneath the waves. That evening at 5 p.m. on the 27th, the Winston Churchill, the oldest boat participating in the race, called a mayday after being knocked on their side by the surging swells, and the crew aboard quickly launched their 2 lifeboats and boarded them, as the Winston Churchill had begun to take on water at an alarming rate. 5 minutes after the Winston Churchill had made its mayday call, it sank into the depths of the seas. All the crew members aboard the vessel had managed to board the 2 lifeboats before its sinking, but the 2 lifeboats soon had become separated from one another. Due to the significant number of distress calls being made by numerous vessels in the fleet by this point, the crew aboard both life rafts were still adrift at around 9 p.m. when one of the rafts was flipped upside down after being tossed by a massive wave. While flipped upside down, the 5 crew members aboard the raft noticed that in this flipped position, the raft was seemingly making its way through the water with much greater ease, although they were also aware that they'd run out of breathable air in the enclosed space within a matter of time. One man aboard the life raft, a man named James Lawler, suggested having him exit the life raft through the zippable door and swim to the surface to try to right the raft, but this idea was soon decided against, as it would have required him to not be wearing a life vest in order to leave the raft, and he could have easily been swept away in the process. Instead, the group decided that they'd cut a hole directly upwards into the bottom of the life raft, which would puncture the raft but would allow them to be able to breathe. About an hour after they had cut the breathing hole in the life raft, they were once again struck by another large wave, which flipped the raft upright once again, and the body weight, now resting on the punctured portion of the raft, began to force the air out of it and caused it to begin to rapidly deflate and split further open. After a short while, the group were clinging to just the frame of the now mostly deflated life raft and continued to maintain their hold on the remnants of the raft well into the night. According to one of the men aboard the raft, sometime that night, estimated to be around 3 a.m. the following morning, the group of 5 were once again struck by another massive wave. The wave knocked loose 3 of the men from the frame: John Dean, James Lawler, and Michael Bannister, who were immediately swept far from the remnants of their life raft and into the raging seas, where all 3 men would ultimately drown. This extreme window of weather that struck the fleet would ultimately cost 6 people their lives, along with sinking 5 of the vessels, and cause the abandonment of 7 vessels, and would become the largest maritime search and rescue operation ever conducted in Australia. Only 44 of the 115 entrants in the race finished it, with the remainder having been forced by the conditions to retire. In the aftermath of the disaster, several investigations into the causations for this tragedy were launched. In one of the reports, the Cruising Yacht Club of Australia was criticized for failing to inform the participants of the race of the severity of the potential weather conditions as they became aware of them, and in the coroner's report, the coroner noted, quote, "From what I have read and heard, it is clear to me that during this crucial time, the race management team played the role of observers rather than managers, and that was simply not good enough." Following the release of this coroner's inquest, the yacht club's race director, a man named Phil Thompson, resigned. However, the CYCA asserted that it was the responsibility of each vessel's managerial teams to properly update their crews with accurate weather information. Ultimately, no individual party was blamed for the series of disastrous events. However, the coroner's inquest would go on to suggest numerous safety measures be added to the requirements for the vessels wishing to enter this race, which were soon made mandatory for entrants. Along with the safety measures added to the vessels, the procedure for relaying accurate meteorological information to the competing crafts has been updated and improved to prevent another tragedy of similar origin from happening again. Thank you all for watching.